don't you go ahead and grab a seat. Like I said up top, this week we're finishing this series we've been on through the book of Romans, which is this letter that we have in the New Testament that the Apostle Paul writes to the church in Rome. Now, when Paul writes this letter to the church in Rome, he's never actually been there. The New Testament's full of letters written by, a lot of them by Paul, to churches. And a lot of the churches Paul started or Paul had a relationship with. But when he writes Romans, he's never actually been there. There's a book in the New Testament called Acts that tells us kind of the origin and expansion of the early church. And really the second part of the book of Acts really concentrates on Paul, because Paul is the one who actually takes the church out of its Jewish roots and engages the larger Gentile world that makes up what we know as like essentially the Eastern Roman Empire. And so the church starts within a Jewish context. Jesus himself doesn't actually start the church, he lays the foundations for the church. The church doesn't begin until after Jesus' death, resurrection, and then his ascension up into heaven, where he promises to return one day. So Jesus lays the groundwork, but it doesn't start until after him. It's his followers that actually start the church. He sends them out to start the church. And the church starts, Jesus lays those foundations almost entirely within a Jewish context. Now, Jesus engages Gentiles, talks with Gentiles, loves Gentiles, serves Gentiles. But Jesus is a Jew, his followers are Jew. Even Paul, who doesn't start following Jesus until after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, is a Jew. And Paul, the reason he begins to follow Jesus is Paul is a devout religious Jew. He is going around actually trying to stop the church. And Jesus kind of appears to him in this light, almost like this kind of vision-y thing. And Jesus says, hey, knock it off. Quit persecuting me and my people. You're the one I'm choosing to take this thing out into the Gentile world. And so he then spends really the rest of his life going around to all these places. And so in the book of Acts, there's 3 journeys, we call them missionary journeys, of Paul's that are kind of reported, where Paul will travel around. Here's a map of his 3rd missionary journey. This is the one during which he writes the book of Romans. So Paul's kind of home-based church is up here in Antioch, which is north of Jerusalem and Israel. This is kind of his home base. It's his sending church. And so this is Paul's 3rd journey. He travels all over the place. When he gets to Corinth over here, which this is a major Roman city, it's from Corinth that Paul writes this letter to the church in Rome. Paul is actually on his way to go back to Jerusalem. The church in Jerusalem has fallen on hard times. He's actually taken up a collection from some of these other churches, and he's going to go back to Jerusalem to visit the church there and to give this gift. And so he writes from Corinth, he writes this letter to the church in Rome, and one, because he's never been there, he's introducing himself. Hey, they've heard of him, no doubt, but it's like, hey, this is who I am. He gives kind of his explanation of this is what faith is all about, this is what it means to be a Christian. And the reason that Paul's going out of his way to try to connect with the church in Rome is because he's hoping to travel to the Western Roman Empire and to use Rome as a new home sending base. Whereas Antioch had been his home sending base in the East, he wants to use Rome in the West. And so it's this whole introductory letter. Again, he lays out, this is what it means to follow Jesus. He talks a lot about the gospel. The gospel is this word that means good news, and it's the word the early church used to describe what God was doing through Jesus. That the gospel is the means by which God is reclaiming creation. He's bringing it back to himself. God is reclaiming himself as the king over all the cosmos. And by doing that, he's renewing creation. He's bringing it back to life. And so that's the gospel. It's the good news of what God is accomplishing through the death and resurrection of Jesus. That he's making everything new, and he, once again, is the lone sovereign king over all of it. That death and sin and evil are being defeated. And so Paul is Paul is explaining to Rome, hey, here's my understanding of the gospel. Here's what it means to be a Christian. He's helping them navigate some issues that they've had within their church, because even though he's never been there, he has friends that are connected there, so he's heard some things. So now we come to the end of Romans, where Paul's just going to kind of wrap it up. And at the end of Romans, Paul's really going to remind the church in Rome of 2 things. He's going to remind them of what's most important and where do we go from here. Now that we've gone through all this, what's most important? Where do we go from here? And Paul's going to do it in a very it's a very caring, personal, and pastoral way. And so here's how it begins. Romans 15, verse 14. He says, I myself am convinced, my brothers and sisters, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with knowledge, and competent to instruct one another. Yet I have written you quite boldly on some points to remind you of them again, because of the grace God gave me to be a minister of Christ Jesus to the Gentiles. He gave me the priestly duty of proclaiming the gospel of God so that the Gentiles might become an offering acceptable to God, sanctified by the Holy Spirit. So the first thing Paul does there is he speaks very well of the Roman church. He says, hey, I want you to know that even though I've never been there, even though we've never met each other face to face, we have a lot of common friends, some similar friends. I hear good things, and you are in a great place. And Paul, what he says in there specifically is he says, listen, you are able to instruct yourselves. That's really a big compliment for Paul, because essentially what he's saying about the Roman church is you are a completely contextual, self-sustaining church. Because again, remember, at the time Paul writes this, it's in like kind of the mid to late 50s. And so the church has only been around for a couple decades. It's pretty young. And so Paul's kind of traveled all over the place, and he started these different churches. But churches are at different places. Some of them are able to function on their own. Some of them need a lot of help, a lot of support. Paul will stay in some areas longer than others. Paul will send some of his associates to certain places. Now, the goal of a church is to be an indigenous, contextual, self-sustaining entity. That's the goal of every local church. See, the church as a whole is like, the church is the name that's given to the community, to the body, to the family, is the way the New Testament talks about it. The family of Jesus. People all around the world that follow Jesus, that believe that Jesus died and rose again and live with him as their king. But the church manifests itself in these local congregations, these local little communities. And the goal of every local community is to be an indigenous, contextual, self-sustaining community so that you have the means in amongst yourselves to build people up in faith, to help people who don't have faith, discover faith, to teach, to educate, to help everyone grow, to experience community renewal, all of that. That's the goal. That's the goal of every single church. And there's a lot of churches that aren't there at the point when Paul writes this. But Paul, when he looks at the church in Rome, says, you guys are there. You're in a really, really good place. You have what you need to be completely self-sustaining. You don't need any outside help, which is a good thing. Doesn't mean you're not connected to outside people, but you have the means and the maturity in amongst yourself to continue your own church, to build your own church. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the early church, and even sometimes I do it, when we talk about the early church, the way the New Testament talks about it, the way the book of Acts talks about it, we kind of assume that like there's one church and it's all the same, and wherever you go, it's kind of all the same, and there's like one central leadership structure, but there isn't. I mean, early on, Jesus' closest followers, the apostles, they're the ones that kind of head everything up. But then as it begins to spread out, especially when Paul comes along and starts planning all these different churches, like all these churches are all different and unique. Even when you read the letters that Paul writes to all these different places, the church in Ephesus is not the same as the church in Corinth. It's not the same as the church in Rome. It's not the same as the church in Thessalonica. It's not the same as the church in Antioch. What they have in common is their faith in Jesus and their belief in the gospel and that they're living with Jesus as their king. Like that's what unites them. But they're all very, very different. So when you talk about the early church, in some ways it might be more accurate to say the early churches. Because it's kind of this group of churches, and they're interconnected, they're related to each other, they partner together, they work with one another, they support with one another, but they're all these independent congregations, these all independent families. And that's okay. In fact, that's the point. The church in Rome is not supposed to look like the church in Corinth. You know why? Because Rome and Corinth are two different places. So what does the church look like in each of those places? How should it find? Now, there's things they have in common. There's things all those churches have in common. But the goal of the church was never uniformity. The goal was always unity. Like what binds us together is our faith in Christ. That looks different in different places, and that's okay. Now, Paul, what's interesting about Paul when you look at Paul is Paul himself has planted about, this is like a rough estimate. There's no way to know for sure. But we believe that Paul himself plants about 20 churches. 20. That's just the ones that he plants. Not every church that he writes to, he started. Not every church he visits that he started. And not every church that he started do we have a letter to. But we think, based on what we know, that Paul starts about 20 churches, which is pretty impressive. But then you got to keep in mind that like Paul starts these churches, and then these churches start other churches. And not only that, but Paul travels with associates throughout the book of Acts. So there's people that go with him. Those people start different churches. So really what Paul does is he starts this like, not just a church, but a network of like reproducing churches. Which now, this is Paul in the introduction here, he's also reminding them of what's most important, because after he compliments them for, hey, you are a healthy, self-sustaining church, and that's great, Then he goes back to remind them of who he is, and he uses this phrase to describe himself that he used in the introduction to the letter, where he talks about himself as a minister to the Gentiles. That's Paul's role. Paul's the guy that God specifically chose to take the gospel and to take the church out of its Jewish context and to embrace the Gentile world. And so that's what Paul's done. He's started this thriving network of reproducing churches all over the Eastern Roman Empire. Again, he's taken 3 trips, and each of the trips, they cover kind of the same area, but they get a little bit bigger, and there's a little bit more. And so Paul now at this point, when he's writing Romans, he's at this point where he's been at this for a while, and there's been some success, and there's some cool things happening. That you have all of these different churches that are starting new churches, and all these associates and co-workers of Paul that are starting all of these different churches. And it's all rooted in this mission to go throughout the empire, this mission that Jesus gave to the apostles before he left. It's what the word apostle actually means, sent one. God sent them out. And so Paul's at this time where he's kind of sensing a transition in what he's going to be doing next. And so that's what he tells them. So after he kind of introduces, not introduce himself, but after he compliments them, hey, you guys are this self-sustaining, thriving, healthy church. That is a great thing. Paul says, I'm a minister to the Gentiles. Here's what's next for us. And here's what he says, Romans 15. He says, but now that there's no more place for me to work in these regions, talking about the Eastern Roman Empire where that map was, and since I've been longing for many years to visit you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to see you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I have enjoyed your company for a while. And so Paul, he's already reminded them of what's most important. Like the mission is what's most important. God has sent us out to start these churches and to share the gospel with this larger Gentile world. And Paul says, I've done that in the East. Now, when Paul says this, there's no more place to work, he's not saying there's nothing left to be done. Paul understands that there's a lot of work yet to be done in the Eastern Roman Empire. There is a lot of people who still need to hear the gospel. There's a lot of people who still need to come to faith in Jesus. There's a lot of brokenness. There's a lot of healing that's needed. Paul's not saying it's all done. Paul's just at this point within himself where he's saying, you know what? I've done my task in that part. What God has specifically given me to do, I've done it there. Now there is this network of thriving, reproducible churches in the Eastern. Now we need that in the West. Paul says the same thing that God did here, God needs to do here. And so Paul says, so that's what comes next. And this is where Paul tells the church in Rome, this is where I need your help. I need you to be for me in the West what Antioch was for me in the East. I need you to be my home base, my sending operation. So I'm going to come see you, and then we're going to continue this thing out West to get a whole new network of reproducing churches that we can bring these two things together. And so the heart of every church, churches are designed to reproduce. And I tell you that, I keep saying that because I just want you to know, as a church, we've been involved in church multiplication, church planning in the past in different ways. But I just need you to know in the future, it's going to be a lot bigger emphasis for us. Because the church is designed to reproduce. It's designed to start new churches. We tend to use a lot of industrial business metaphors when we talk about the church. Jesus and Paul and the writers of the New Testament, they use organic metaphors, plants and fruit and things like that. And when you think organically, organic things grow to a certain point and then they reproduce. That's what they do. Healthy organic things reproduce. The church is designed to reproduce. So when it comes to the work that we do, both locally in our country and even around the world, we try to partner with people who are intentionally planting indigenous, self-sustaining churches. That's the goal. So again, Paul's done this in the East. Now he wants to go do this in the West. And so he lays out, hey, here's what's most important, this mission that we're on, and here's what's coming next. And so he's laid out for them the vision, this is where we're going, and now he's going to wrap up the whole letter. And again, this is where Paul, he gets really, really personal in the last part, because Paul's going to go on and he's going to mention 29 people by name as he closes this thing out. And he's going to reference these people really for a couple different reasons. One is because these people are meaningful to Paul, and Paul wants to thank them personally. He's writing this whole letter to the church in Rome, but he wants to specifically, hey, I want to thank you, and I want to thank you. The other thing is, this list of people serves as essentially references for Paul. You know how when you apply for a job, you have to put references? Hey, if you think I'm sketchy, contact these people, and they'll tell you I'm not. Remember, Paul in some ways is applying for a job here. Hey, I want you to be my home-based sending church, and I know you and I don't know each other, and I've kind of explained to you who I am. If you want to know more, just contact one of these people. They know me. And so Paul lists these 29 people by name, and some of them, if you're familiar with Paul, they're familiar names. Because if you read through the book of Acts, Paul has some companions, Priscilla and Aquila and Timothy, and so Paul mentions them in the end of Romans. But there's also some new names. There's a mix of Jewish names and Gentile names. It's kind of this diverse group of people that make up this whole thing called the church. And Paul's saying, hey, even though I've never been to your church, you've never met me, here's all these people that we have in common. Here's where the work is blending. Here's where it's this cool thing. Now, one of the things I think that's worth noting at the end of Romans that is really, really fascinating is I said Paul mentions 29 people by name. 19 of them are men. 10 of them are women. But here's what's super fascinating. Of the 19 men that Paul mentions by name, he only references the ministry work of 3 of them. So he'll mention my name, thank you so much, but when it comes to this is a person who's done great things in the context of leadership within the church, he only mentions that of 3 men. Of the 10 women that he mentions, he compliments the ministry work of 7 of them. And there's a few of them that are quite interesting. Here's a few of the women that Paul mentions in the end of Romans. First is Phoebe, who's a deacon from Cenchreae, who delivered the letter. Now, Cenchreae is another city, and a deacon is a position of leadership within the church. And so when he's in Corinth, and when he writes this letter to the church in Rome, he actually gives it to Phoebe to deliver. And she's the one who takes it to Rome and delivers the letter. Now, there's no way to prove this because we don't exactly know what happened when the letter was delivered. But typically, the way things were typically done is when someone would deliver a letter like this from someone else, they would get up and they would read the letter, but then the people in the church would have questions. What does Paul mean when he says this? And what does Paul mean when he said that? And is he angry here? Is he this? Is he that? Who's the best person to answer those questions besides Paul himself, the person who was just with him and delivered the letter? Hey, you were with Paul. What does he mean here? What does he mean there? Or even just other questions. How's Paul doing? And so most of the time, pretty much what was standard practice is the person who delivered the letter would then get up in front of the church, read the letter, and then explain it and basically teach it. Like, here's what Paul's really saying. Here's what he means. So as much as we can't prove it, the most likely scenario is that Phoebe is actually the first person ever to deliver a sermon on the book of Romans in the context of a church. That she stands up in the church of Rome and says, hey, here's this letter. Here's what Paul wrote. Here's what he meant. Another person Paul references is Mary, who is a leader within the Roman church. And the last one, this is the most interesting one, Junia, who Paul refers to as an apostle and a follower of Jesus even before Paul was. Now again, apostle, I mentioned this earlier, the word apostle literally means sent one. And so the apostles were those people whom Jesus himself specifically sent. The only way you could carry the title of apostle is if Jesus, like personally Jesus looked at you and said, you go. You go tell people the gospel, you go plant churches. This is why in Paul's life, what's funny about Paul is Paul grows up a Jew, and he doesn't start to follow Jesus until after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. Paul's actually on the road to Damascus, and he's actually trying to persecute the church and stop the church. And while he's riding on the road, Jesus like kind of appears to him almost like in a vision, and like he knocks him down and he goes blind, and Jesus audibly speaks to him and says, hey, knock it off, quit doing this. I'm now choosing you to take this thing out into the Gentile world. And so Paul keeps trying to convince everyone that he's an apostle. I'm an apostle, I'm an apostle, I'm an apostle. But a lot of people look at him and go, dude, you didn't even follow Jesus when he was around. You never hung out with him. You never had breakfast with him. You never went fishing with him. Paul's like, yeah, but he spoke to me. He's the only reason I'm here. I get that it was after he ascended into heaven. And so Paul, if you read his letters through the New Testament, he's always having to defend himself as an apostle. Because people are like, well, yeah, but you're like a diet apostle, like you're like a junior apostle, you're not. Paul's like, no, Jesus sent me, because that's what an apostle means. This is why within the history of the church, there aren't apostles after the first generation of churches, because Jesus wasn't there to send anyone else. The apostles are those people whom Jesus specifically sent. So apostle doesn't necessarily refer to like a specific office in the early church. But the apostles were kind of the ones that everyone deferred to. Like these are the leaders. These are the ones that guide the whole thing. And so the fact that Paul would use this phrase to refer to a woman is fascinating. And here's why I bring this up. Because Paul is the guy that most often his words are used to limit the role of women within the context of the church. Because there are letters that Paul writes, like in Corinthians and things like that, when he's writing to these churches, and he'll say things about, hey, when you gather together, don't have the women talk. And so a lot of times we look at these things and we're like, well, women can't do this in the church or women can't do that in the church because look at what Paul says. And I'm not trying to take away from what Paul says, but here's what I'm saying. Look at what was actually happening in Paul's ministry and in the world of the church in the first century. And again, I'm not discounting anything Paul writes, but I'm saying Paul writes all these letters to these specific, indigenous, contextual churches who are each dealing with different issues. And I think there's all things that we learn from that. But if you just look at one or two things that Paul wrote and you say, well, here's the thing, Paul says this, so we can't do it. What I'm saying is, let's look at the whole thing. Yeah, let's look at what Paul wrote. Let's understand what Paul wrote. And let's understand, like, what of what Paul said was universal, what of what Paul says was contextual, but also, let's look at what was happening. Because within the context of Paul's ministry, Paul is celebrating women that are in leadership roles. He's elevating women to leadership roles that they didn't even have before. So before you take one little thing and like, oh, look at this is what's actually happening. This isn't some description of what Paul's saying, this is ideally what should happen, or it's not what Paul's saying, like, here's what's happening in this location, or here's how we deal with this problem in this location. Paul says, here's what's happening, and from what Paul says in Romans, he says, and I like it. It's good with it. And not only that, but 70% of the women are leading within the church, whereas, 15% of the men? So this is what Paul celebrates and advances the status of women within his ministry and within the early church. And another thing that's interesting about this list of 29 people that Paul references at the end of Romans is he talks about a lot of different houses in Rome, and he talks about the churches that are meeting in those houses. And so even when you talk about the church in Rome, I think sometimes we get this image that Paul's writing to the church in Rome, and it's one building and it's one gathering. No, the church in Rome is a bunch of little churches that I'm sure they do come together at certain times, but they're a bunch of little churches. And what they all have in common is they all have faith in Jesus, but each one of those churches might be a little bit different. And so one of the things that really jumps out to me when you read the end of Romans is if you read the end of Romans, and if you kind of can read between the lines and see what's actually happening, Paul's kind of, again, he doesn't say it outright, but he's kind of describing what the church looks like and how the church operates. And when you read between the lines at the end of Romans, you come to understand that I think there's something fundamental about the church that we're missing. There's something that's fundamental about the nature of the church and how we're to think about the church and how the church should operate that you and I, in our current context, we're missing. Now, the fact that we're missing it is not new. In fact, I would say we're not missing it. I would say we lost it. But it's not like we lost it recently. In fact, I would argue that we lost it like 1,700 years ago. Because here's what happens. When you look at the nature of the early church, and this is the church that Paul's describing, the early churches, all these different churches. For the first 300 years, essentially, of the church's existence, the church is a persecuted, marginal minority. That's what they are. The Roman government doesn't like them. It's illegal to be a Christian. They're targeting them. They see them as a threat to Roman unity. So they're killing them, persecuting them, throwing them in jail. And persecution's kind of, it goes up and down, but it's almost kind of a constant threat to some level. And so they're this persecuted minority. But what keeps the church going is that they have been sent on this mission from Jesus. Go into the world and teach people the gospel and show them what it looks like to live the gospel. Not just proclaim it, but actually live it. And so they are this persecuted, powerless minority. Then you get to Constantine. When Constantine becomes emperor, everything changes. Because Constantine legalizes Christianity, which ultimately paves the way for the conversion of the empire to Christianity. So in the late 300s, the Roman Empire actually becomes Christian. And when that happens, overnight, everyone in the empire is automatically Christian. We're a Christian empire. You live within the empire, you're Christian. I don't want to be Christian. Too bad, you're Christian. You're one of us. And so what happens, and that shift, Constantine legalizes it like in, I think, 320 somewhere, and the empire converts in 380. So over that, 50, 60 years, whatever it is, in that time, the church pretty quickly goes from a persecuted, powerless minority to the powerful majority. And so what happens now is Christianity is no longer this mission that we're on, that Jesus sent us on. Christianity is now a civilization that we have to manage. What emerges out of that is what's known as Christendom. And Christendom is this Christian civilization. And so when the church all of a sudden becomes powerful, then structures within the church get formalized. And really what happens is instead of being this kind of missional thing that people are living that is a countercultural movement, a culture that's counter to Rome, now Christianity becomes something that we manage, and it becomes something that we put structure to. And so what happens with what we call the Constantinian shift is that Christianity, actually, I would argue, what it becomes is it becomes an organization that needs to be managed rather than a mission that is being lived. In its earliest days, the church was a movement. That's what it was. It was a movement. It was a movement that was fueled by a purpose. With the Constantinian shift, all of a sudden the church became, no, this is something that we have to control and manage. There's a great article I found in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, written by Hildy Gottlieb, I think is how you say it. And the article was really about the differences between an organization and a movement. And what are those differences? And here's some of the things that were noted in this article. Is an organization. An organization identifies its mission as something. So when you start an organization, you pick what your mission, like we're a computer organization and we're going to make the best computers on the planet. We are going to make the best pizzas on the planet. We are going to have the best services available in this particular area. So you pick a mission and you identify it. Some of it's like super specialty, like we're going to make this one part for this computer. So you identify your mission. You choose. A movement is birthed from a mission. A movement is, no, there's already a mission happening, and we need to get behind this and fuel this thing and take it to the next level. We're not creating a mission. There's already a mission. And the movement was born out of that mission that already exists. Organizations always talk about this is how we do things. Right? You have your big organizations. We're Apple, and this is how we do things. We're Disney, this is how we do things. We're Target, this is how we do things. Organizations have their certain way that they do things. It becomes kind of their brand. Movements, in a movement, this is really important, form follows function. So again, what that means is this is the way we do things. That's the form. That's the style, right? Like, again, Disney, Apple, they all have a style. But in a movement, the form the movement takes isn't nearly as important as the function. And again, because in a movement, we're about this mission. And so everything we do is about fueling this mission. So you know what determines the way we structure and the way we organize and the way we go about doing what we do? The mission. If it serves the mission, we keep doing it. If it doesn't serve the mission, guess what? We stop. Because the way we do things doesn't matter. What we do matters. So that form always follows the function. Function comes first in a movement. In organizations create order and they're process-based. Like we got to streamline this. What's the most efficient and effective way that we can do this? And how do we do it in an orderly way? Movements, they create action and they're based on values. Movements say, here's what we value. Here's what's important to us. And because this is what's important to us, this is what we're going to do. And it may not always be the most structured thing in the world. Doesn't mean it's total chaos or anarchy. It may not be super structured or super systematized. But you know what? Based on our values, this is what we're going to do. And we're going to mobilize as many people as we can to do this thing because this is what's important to us. In organizations, you are accountable to the organization. Well, one of the ways you hear this a lot, at least I do, is football. If you're familiar with football, the NFL. The NFL's logo is a shield. And so what you'll hear sometimes is you'll see players, you see it all the time actually now, is players will get in trouble for something they did wrong. And then the NFL will come in and they'll discipline them. And one of the ways they talk about it is with your behavior. If you are a part of the NFL, if you're a player within the NFL, if you're a coach in the NFL, your behavior has to protect the shield. Because if you do something wrong, it reflects negatively on us as an organization. That's how organizations work. You're accountable to the organization. If you do something that makes the organization look, that's not good, and everything you do has to make the organization look bad. But in a movement, you're accountable to the cause. It's not about the organization. It's about the cause. It's about the mission. That's what matters, not the organization. That's why Paul, in the New Testament, when people will do things and people will make mistakes, Paul won't say, you're making the church in Ephesus look bad. Paul will talk about the cause of Christ. And Paul will say, don't compromise the mission of Jesus because that's what's important. In organizations define success internally. Did we make more? Are there more profits? Are we getting better? Are we growing? Movements define it externally because movements, we're trying to accomplish something. We're trying to change something. Are things changing in the world around us because we exist? Organizations are rigid, whereas movements are agile. We can pivot. We can make changes quick. We're not stuck. Organizations are about improvement. How do we make this thing better? We make computers, let's make computers better. We make pizza, let's make pizza better. We do this, let's do this better. Movements are about renewal. We're changing the whole thing. We're not just making it a little better. This whole thing is broken, and we're going to redo the whole thing from the inside out. It's going to be brand new. There's a difference between an organization with a movement. Now, hear me on this, because this is important. I'm not saying organizations are bad, and I'm not saying that as a church, we can't learn things from an organization. Especially in the world and culture we live in, there will be organizational aspects to every church. We're a 501c3 nonprofit. So there are organizational aspects to what we do in terms of how we manage our business and go about all of that. So I'm not saying organizations are bad. I'm not saying there's not things churches can't learn from organizations. But what I'm saying is, in our very core, the church is not an organization. Jesus did not lay the groundwork for the church to be an organization. He laid the groundwork for the church to be a movement. That's what the church always was. That's the foundation that Jesus laid. That's what his apostles did with it. That's how Paul and the early church led it, all the way until you get up to the point of the Constantinian shift. That's when it shifted. That's when we lost the movement and we became an organization. And I really think one of the things we need to do is we need to reclaim the fact that in our core, in our DNA, as a church, we are a movement. Because we're birthed out of a mission. The church was created because of the mission of God. Jesus came to earth. God came to earth in the person of Jesus in order to renew and save creation. That's the biblical story. That God creates it all and it's all good, but then there's chaos and there's sin and there's evil and it all gets messed up. So God comes to earth in the person of Jesus to reclaim his sovereignty. His kingdom is the word that Jesus uses. To reclaim his kingdom, to put his kingdom over all of creation, to bring creation back to him so that he and he alone is king over all of it again. And he's going to defeat sin and death and all of that stuff, bring it back to himself, and the result of that will be the renewal of all creation. That's the mission of God. And the church exists because of that mission. Jesus, when he gets done with his life, as he's getting ready to ascend into heaven, he looks at his apostles, his followers, and he said, okay, you've seen what I started. You're going to go out and keep doing that same thing. The church was born because of the mission. It's not like Jesus created the church and thought, you know what, I need to give you a purpose. The church was born because that mission already existed. And so this is the definition that we've come up with for mission here at FCC. You won't see this anywhere else. This is ours. So here's how we define the mission of the church. Mission is the whole life of the church that bears witness to and invites people into the reign of God. Because again, what Jesus talked about more than anything was the kingdom of God. That in Jesus, through his death and resurrection, essentially there's a regime change. That prior to Jesus, sin and death ruled creation, but now because of Jesus and his death and resurrection, now God is taking charge again. He's bringing it back to himself. And so the kingdom of God is about living with God in charge of our life. And so the mission of the church is to proclaim that and also live that. It's to proclaim to the world, hey, in Jesus, God is breaking through and he's bringing creation back to himself and establishing himself as king. And we're going to show you what it looks like when you live with God as king. The church, what the church is supposed to be is the church is supposed to be a picture of what the end of human history will look like. Because in the biblical story, when you get to the end and Jesus returns and God overcomes it all of a sudden God alone is completely sovereign. He is king, and death and sin and all of that has been defeated. And so the church now is supposed to show the rest of the world what the end of history will look like. You want to know where this is all going? Here's where it's all going. That's what we're supposed to be. But again, I think somewhere along the way, we've lost some of that because we've become this organization that what we need to recover is that in our DNA, we are a movement. We are a movement that exists because God has a mission in the world, and whether we like it or not, and whether we think he made the right or wrong choice, God has chosen to further that mission through the church. He's entrusted that mission to the church. And so if we want to recover what it really means to be a movement as a church, then we need to recover our mission. We need to realize that we are, at our heart, we are a missional entity. See, the problem is when you make the church an organization, the church becomes the end goal. What's the goal of the church? To grow the church, to get the church bigger. We need a bigger church. We need a better. No. The church was never supposed to be an end to itself. The church was a means to an end. The end is the reign of God. The end is that God's reign would advance in people's lives, in our community, in our county, in our city, in our nation, in our world. That's the goal. That's the mission. And us reclaiming what it means to be a movement as a church begins with us as individuals recommitting ourselves to the mission that gave birth to the church anyway. Our church, I've talked about this before, our church comes out of this movement that is known as it's either the Stone Campbell movement or the Restoration movement. And it's called the Stone Campbell movement because the people that started it, Barton W Stone was one, and then the Campbells, Alexander and Thomas, were another. But that movement actually comes out of a pretty interesting time in the history of Christianity in America. In the early 1800s, there's this kind of big revival that's known as the Second Great Awakening in America. There was a first one that had been all kinds of revivals, but when you get to the early 1800s, there's like the Second Great Awakening is what they call it, and it's this Protestant revival that happens largely like in at the time what was like the Western United States and what was like expanding into the frontier. So believe it or not, at that point, like the Western United States is like Kentucky, Tennessee, and beginning to expand west. And so in Kentucky, Tennessee, kind of in that area, you have all these people that are coming together for like these revival meetings. And they'll set up tents and they'll go to these revival camps and they'll get together for like a week and like thousands or hundreds of people will gather and people will get up and they'll preach and teach and people will recommit themselves to Jesus and new people will begin to follow Jesus. And it's kind of this like crazy, chaotic time. And in the midst of that, one of the things you have happening is you have Presbyterians and Methodists who are two different Christian denominations, if you've ever heard of them. Christian denominations are Christian groups that all follow Jesus, but they've broken off for different reasons over the years. And so you had Presbyterians and Methodists that started coming together to share in these like revival camp meetings. And a lot of them were really excited because like, hey, this is about unity. Because again, going back to the early church, it's like, it's supposed to be about unity. We're supposed to get along. That's part of the purpose. But you had some Presbyterians and Methodists that were getting mad and like, how can you do this? And why would you meet with them? And they're wrong on this and they're wrong on that. But you had these groups that were coming together. And this is where Stone and Barton Stone and the Campbells emerge. Here's pictures of them. Here's Barton W Stone. Barton W Stone he's the man. The Campbells, Alexander Campbell was the dad. Thomas Campbell was the son. Not gonna lie, that picture of Thomas Campbell kind of scares me. It's just intimidating. He looks intimidating. Like he doesn't look like let's talk about your life. Anyway, but Barton W Stone is the man. So Barton W Stone is one of the guys that's kind of like on the leading edge of this. And here's what's crazy about Barton Stone, that I share this with you because I want you to know this is like in the DNA of our church because we come from this movement. So Barton W Stone is a preacher, he's a minister in Kentucky, which is in the South at the time. Because remember, this is early 1800s, it's pre-Civil War, slavery is still a legal institution in the South. Barton Stone is a minister, he's a preacher in the South. Barton Stone will not let anyone in his congregation hold a leadership position if they own slaves. Even though it's totally legal, he won't let them do it. He won't let them do it at all. It's like, it's against everything for him. It's like, this is not right, this is evil, this is wrong. When they begin to hold these like camp meetings, these revival meetings, and some of them Stone is a part of, they're bringing together not just Presbyterians and Methodists and even other denominations, but they start bringing together black and white people. And at some of these meetings, they actually convince some of the white people to free their black slaves, to let them go. And what's even crazier is later on in his life, Barton Stone and his wife will actually inherit slaves from, I believe it's her parents. Her parents die and they like deed them because they were considered property. They deed them slaves. But they live in the South in Kentucky, so they can't legally set them free. So Stone packs up his whole family, moves everything up north, I think to Indiana, so he can free the slaves. So that's just like part of his DNA. It's part of what's in the DNA of our church. So what's cool, and I say that to say, like, you have all this cool stuff that's happening at this period of time. You have these people that are coming together and they're talking about the gospel and you have social change that's happening and people are advocating for things that are considered radical and there's all this transformation and it's super cool. And this is where Stone is doing this on one end, but then the Campbells are doing this on the other, and they come together and they adopt this name. The name they pick is Christian. And what they say is like, look, it's not like that was a new word. The word had been around before, but that was the word that kind of referred to everybody. Like, yeah, you're a Christian, but we're a Baptist Christian, or you're a Methodist Christian, or a Presbyterian Christian. They were like, no, we're just going with Christian. And the reasoning was, we're not the only Christians, but that's all we are as Christians. So they wanted to bring people together. So anything they saw as divisive, they kind of tried to get rid of. And when I say divisive, it wasn't even that it was bad or wrong. It's just like if they looked at something and said, you know what, this just isn't essential and it causes us to divide, so let's get rid of it. So like one of the things they got rid of was creeds. They didn't want anything to do with creeds. That's why if you've ever been at a formal church, a lot of times they'll say things like the Apostles' Creed. You don't really hear us talk about it here. And really, it goes back to these guys. And it wasn't that they didn't like the creeds like the Apostles' Creed. It wasn't they didn't believe them. They did believe them. But they said the problem with these creeds is like, first of all, the creeds took Christianity from something you did to something you believed in. Before the creeds existed, like we didn't say like, we believe in forgiveness. We did forgiveness. We did restoration. So you can believe something and then you don't ever actually have to do anything. Oh, I believe in grace. Well, you're a judgmental jerk, but I'm glad you believe in grace. It's like, so they were like, all it does is divide us. And so they tried to like pare it down. That's why it also went the name Restoration Movement, because they're trying to restore it. Like, what is faith really all about? What is the church really all about? And so here's what's incredible. Most people draw the origin of the Stone Campbell movement back to this event called Cane Ridge. It was a Cane Ridge revival. In fact, if you can go today to the Cane Ridge Meeting House. It's in Kentucky. I've been there. It's in the middle of nowhere now, so it was in the middle of nowhere then. It's just this little house, and they had this big revival. And here's actually a sketch. It's hard to see because it's an old sketch, but this is a sketch of the actual Cane Ridge revival. And this was 1801 is when the Cane Ridge revival happened. And it was like a week-long thing, and you see someone preaching here, and there's all these people. And what they estimated was that over the course of this whole week, not at one time, but over the course of this whole week, 20,000 people came to the Cane Ridge revival, which at the time was 10% of the population of Kentucky. They got 10% of the population of their state to come to one revival. And again, they weren't just happening at Cane Ridge, they were happening all over the place. 10% of the people in 1801. And it was a crazy, if you ever read about it, it was crazy chaotic, people falling all over the place. It was nuts. But this is kind of the origin of the Stone Campbell movement. So this is where it begins. Okay, that's 1801. By the time you get to 1830, there are 22,000 people in the Stone Campbell movement. 30 years later, in 1860, there are 192,000 people in the Stone Campbell movement, as it just keeps growing and spreading. 1890, 30 years later, 641,000. By the time you get to 1900, 10 years later, over 1.1 million. I mean, it exploded. And part of the reason it exploded is because these guys, and it wasn't just them, there was other people, other men and women that were involved, but they understood that this was about a movement. And so what that movement ultimately brought revival. That's the word we would use, revival. And for a lot of people, for a lot of Christians, when we look at our world right now and the shape of our culture and everything, that's what we want. We're like, we want revival, we want revival. But I think sometimes we forget where revival begins, because if you look throughout the history, Stone Campbell movement is one example, but you can look for every other. Revival always begins in the same place. And you know where revival begins? I'm going to put it up here. Revival begins when Christians take Jesus seriously in ways they have not previously. Always. See, I think sometimes we get this notion that revival begins just because people wake up one day and be like, oh, I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to go to church today. No. People are inspired to do that because they see their friends, their community members, their family begin to take Jesus seriously in ways they hadn't before. You know why the Stone Campbell movement spread? Because you had people like Stone and like the Campbells who began to say, hey, when Jesus prayed for the unity of his church and that unity was the central idea behind mission, what if we took that seriously? Because you had people like Stone, who in this context where slavery was this evil institution, Stone was willing to say, what would it look like if we really believed that all men and women were made in the image of God? And we really were all equal. How would that be different? What would that look like? See, that's where revival begins, when we begin to take Jesus seriously. When Jesus talks about serving, when Jesus talks about generosity, when Jesus talks about sharing the gospel. What if we took Jesus seriously in ways that we hadn't before? That's where revival begins. Because when Christians begin to do that, that's when people outside begin to take notice and like, whoa. See, revival doesn't begin out there. It begins in here. It begins when you and I start to take Jesus seriously in ways that we haven't before. Some of us have never taken Jesus seriously. And it's not a bag, just some of us are newer to church, we're checking it out. Or some of us could have gone to church our whole life, but we've just never taken it seriously. It's just been this casual thing. Revival begins when you and I start to take Jesus seriously in one new area. And that leads to another, and that leads to another. So what are the areas in your life? What's one area in your life? Because see, here's the thing. When you and I start to take Jesus seriously in new ways, then we begin to recover the mission. Because what is the mission? The whole life of the church that bears witness and invites people into the reign of God. When I begin to take people seriously, then my life becomes a proclamation to the goodness and the reign of God. And other people begin to see that, and then other people want to know, what's that all about? That's what creates revival. See, it starts when you and I begin to take Jesus seriously. That leads to mission. When we all live on mission, that's what creates a movement, and a movement ultimately leads to revival. But it starts with us. You know, I look back over these last couple of years and just the whole COVID experience and all that kind of stuff, and I realize that all of us throughout these last couple of years, we've all lost things. We have, whatever it is. These last couple of years have been so crazy that there's things that we've lost, but I think there's also things that we've gained. And here's my deepest hope. And I shared this with you as we kind of wrap up this whole Romans thing. Here's my deepest hope. I pray with all my heart that one of the things that we have lost as a church over this last year is the sense of FCC, the organization. And I pray that what we have gained is FCC, the movement. Because here's the thing. I'm not a CEO. Not a business person. I'm not. I don't know how to do that. I don't want to do that. Don't believe that's what God called and equipped me to do. When I come back in the fall, we're a movement. Because that's who we were always created to be. I'm going to spend this summer studying and praying and thinking about what does it mean to be a movement. And I hope that you'll do the same. Because Jesus commissioned us to be a movement. And a movement begins when you and I recover the mission. And that starts by us taking Jesus seriously. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. Thank you for everything you've given to us. I thank you that you came down to this earth on a mission. And God, the church was born out of that mission. And God, I think for good intentions, we lost the sense of movement that we had. You know, sometimes things happen so quick and we don't bother to kind of evaluate what happens. But I think when you look back on history, the history of Christianity, the history of Western civilization, you can see how we morphed over time. We morphed from a movement into an institution, into an organization. And God, I pray that one of the things that we can reclaim during this season is the reality that the church is a movement. That's what we are. We're a movement, and God, we're not an end to ourselves. We are a means to an end, and that end is your reign, your kingdom advancing. But God, recovering ourselves as a movement begins with each one of us beginning to take you seriously in areas that we haven't before. So, Father, I pray that you'd help us this week. You'd help us kind of evaluate our life, where we're at and where we're going, and just to ask ourselves, what's one area? Where can I start with one area? Where's one area that I can take Jesus seriously in that I haven't before? Because starting in that one area, that's what kindles a sense of mission in us. That's what creates a movement within our church, and that's what brings about revival within our context. God, we love you and thank you, and we pray this in Jesus' name.